The WiiM Mini is absolutely all you need to stream high-res music, and anything else is a total rip-off. Or is it? I've got the WiiM Mini, I've got the WiiM Pro and the Pro Plus here, and I've compared them extensively with each other. I've also tested them with external DACs. And then to take it a step further, I've also put them up against the EverSolo DMP-A6. That was all to find the answer of whether or not a WiiM Mini is all you actually do need, and what I discovered along the way was the answer to that question, but also a little bit more. Before I get into the review too much, I want to say a huge thanks to Radio Parts. Radio Parts is an online and bricks and mortar retailer and wholesaler of electronic parts and also electronic devices. And I want to say a huge thanks to them because they've sent me out the WiiM Mini, Pro and Pro Plus for me to check out. As always with a review like this, I'll put links down below through to Radio Parts. There's no affiliation there. I get nothing back from sharing that with you, but it's a great way to say thank you to them for sending out the WiiM series for me to check out. So if you're in Melbourne or indeed in Australia, check out the links down below through to Radio Parts. If you're elsewhere in the world, I'll also put links through to Amazon, etc. so you can pick up the WiiMs there if you think it's a good idea based on what I'm going to tell you. Just to quickly introduce these devices, we've got the WiiM Mini. This is the entry level, the most basic version of these products. And this comes in at $109 US. I'll explain the features, the functions, all that in a minute, but $109 is where you start for the WiiM Mini. We then jump up to the WiiM Pro, which is $169 US, and then finally you get to the WiiM Pro Plus, and this one's $219 US. So we're jumping between a range of just over $100 to just over $200 US. Many of you will already know this already, but the simplest explanation for what these do is they're media streaming devices. So the idea is you connect them up to your internet via a LAN connection, that's the wired Ethernet connection, or via a wireless connection. And then from there, you can stream services like Spotify, Tidal, Cobas. I think AirPlay is on there as well, Roon, they're Roon ready as well. So any of those sorts of services that you're used to seeing, and it's pretty much all of them I think are available through the WiiM app. We'll talk about that heaps later. But all that is then available through these boxes. There's no displays on them as you can see, but there are some simple touch controls. And so everything does get controlled via an app, and it's a very, very well designed app. If you're familiar with the channel at all, you'll probably already know that I don't tend to focus on these products from a basic usability point of view. I will talk about it if there's any issues with it, and of course I'll give praise where it's due. But what I'm more interested about here on Passion for Sound is how these sorts of products perform from an audiophile or a music lover perspective. How well do they allow me and you to enjoy our music? And so let me introduce to you now the key differences between each of these from a specifications point of view, with a view to how that's going to influence the listening experience with them. The first thing to mention is we've got some significant differences in terms of the DACs used in these. So DACs being your digital to analog converter, it's the bit that takes the data coming in from the stream, from Spotify, Cobas, Tidal, and turns that into the analog sound that goes out to your speakers or your headphones. In the case of the WiiM Mini and the WiiM Pro, we're using a pretty basic Texas Instruments PCM 5121 DAC. Now don't worry too much if that doesn't mean anything to you. I'll put all this into context of what it actually means shortly. But if we jump then up to the Pro Plus, what we start to get in the Pro Plus is the AKM AK4493 SEQ DAC. And so what that tells us from a listening point of view is that if you're taking an analog output from all of these out to say a pair of active speakers or to a power amplifier and a pair of passive speakers, what that means is that you're theoretically going to get much better sound from the Pro Plus through those analog outputs. However, if you're just using digital outputs, it shouldn't make any difference. Speaking of the inputs and outputs, now's probably a good time to talk about the various inputs and outputs on these devices with some quick device tours. And if we start off with the WiiM Mini, as you'd expect with its size, there's not a lot going on. We've got some touch controls on top, a little indicator light on top as well. And then if we look at the back of the unit, we've got, I just have to look at it to remind myself, we've got auxiliary in, auxiliary out, we've got USB-C, that's just for power, and we've got an optical output. And so essentially what you can do is you can feed an external source into this, let's say a portable music player, maybe you've got a turntable you want to feed into it, whatever's going to make it easy for you to feed into this and then connect this out to whatever speakers you're using. The WiiM Mini is going to do that for you. And then from there, you've got the output again to go out to a pair of speakers or an amplifier, etc. Or you can take the optical feed out if you have an external DAC. If we then go over to the WiiM Pro, you can see here it's a chunkier device. There's obviously more going on inside. There's also more inputs and outputs on the back. And so as a quick tour, we've got some touch controls across the front and an indicator light on the front. And then if we swing around and look at the back of it, what we've got on the back again is USB-C for power. We've now got an RCA line input, an RCA line output, We've got a pair of optical sockets here, one is an input, one is an output. We've also now got a coaxial output, a 12-volt trigger output, and an Ethernet connection. So let me explain a bit about what's going on here. Firstly, we've got upgraded inputs and outputs using RCA instead of 3.5mm. So if we go back to the WiiM Mini, we just had 3.5mm on here. It's an okay connection, but it's not as high quality as separate RCAs. We've then, as well as the optical output that you had on the WiiM Mini, we've now got an optical input. So you could feed something like the output from a CD player into this, or from a TV into this. And that means you can kind of make the WiiM Pro a little bit of a central point in your system, rather than having lots of different inputs and outputs to think of on a receiver. This could be the central hub of your system, and then send a single output to your receiver or your DAC, so you don't have to keep switching inputs on your DAC or your receiver based on what you're listening to. Everything just goes via this and keeps it simple. Looking at the coaxial output next, that just gives us flexibility. You might not want to use optical, maybe you've already used the optical input on your DAC and you need a different option. Now you've got two different options to choose from to go into your DAC, that just gives us versatility. Above that, I mentioned the 12-volt trigger, that's going to switch on or off different devices that have this functionality. And so the idea is that with a lot of power amps or other sort of home theater, home stereo devices, they'll accept the 12-volt input to actually trigger them to power on and off based on what's happening with the WiiM Pro. And so it's just a power saving and a convenience feature. Finally, the Ethernet connection, as I mentioned before, is so you can connect this to a wired network. So keeping in mind, the WiiM Mini is wireless only, so Wi-Fi only. In the case of the WiiM Pro, this is going to give you Ethernet or Wi-Fi, it's got both. In my experience, there's not actually any significant difference between the two in terms of quality, it's more about convenience. And you may find that a wired connection is more stable and faster, so there's less chance potentially of it dropping out or lagging as you're streaming your music. And so if we put down the WiiM Pro and we look at the WiiM Pro Plus, one thing I'll tell you is it's immediately heavier to pick up. There's obviously more going on inside here. I'm not going to open this up because I don't own them, but you can feel straight away that there's a bit more significant circuitry inside the WiiM Pro Plus. But if we look at the back, it's exactly the same as the WiiM Pro. So in terms of the inputs, outputs, and functionality, everything's exactly the same here. The differences between the two are more about the internal specs. For example, if we look at the line inputs, all three devices have line inputs. In order for the volume control to work on these line inputs, it has to get converted from the analog signal coming in through an analog to digital converter, and then it's adjusted in terms of volume in the digital domain to keep it all lossless, and then converted back and spat out through the analog outputs, or it's sent out through the digital outputs. So that's really good for convenience, but it does mean that you are converting an analog signal into digital and then potentially back again. So if you're running something like a turntable into this, do be aware you might lose a little bit of the benefit of that vinyl sound because it's actually going digital before it gets to you. The other thing that's influenced here is that if you're talking about the Pro Plus, it's actually doing a higher sample rate, therefore theoretically a higher quality of that conversion process. And so the line input, and by the way, I haven't tested this, I'm not set up with any kind of external devices that warranted it, but the line input from the Pro Plus 2 should give you better performance than the line input on either the Pro or the WiiM Mini. But I'm more focused here on how they perform as streamers, so I've had to focus my time on that so as not to blow out this review into a really long video. And so inputs, outputs, general functionality, they're pretty much the same between these two. We've got a few less inputs and outputs on the WiiM Mini, but beyond that, they're all set up to do roughly the same thing, and that is to take streamed audio and spit it out to your speakers or your amplifier. Speaking of streaming, one other thing I should point out is that if anyone wants to use Chromecast audio, you need to go to the bigger boxes for that one. It's not available as an option, that being Chromecast audio, and therefore Google interactions and functionality is not on the WiiM Mini, but it is on the Pro and the Pro Plus. In addition to those streaming services that I mentioned before, it is worth pointing out all of these will work with DLNA servers. So if you're running media software like JRiver, or maybe you've got a network attached storage device in your home with your music on it, if that's got DLNA capabilities, you can send the audio from those devices straight to your WiiMs. There's also Spotify and Tidal Connect on these. And as I said before, the list of available apps is pretty extensive. I'm not going to try to list them all here, but you can go and check it all out on the website. You'll also see in the screen footage of the app that I'm going to show you here on screen. But the key point is that it does pretty much everything you can think of, I think. Now, in addition to having access to all those streaming services and a very lovely, fluid and simple interface, You also get access to both a 10-band graphic equalizer and a parametric equalizer if you want to do that with these. The parametric equalizer, as far as I can tell from my playing around with it, is limited to 4 bands, but that's still some pretty good power. You can only run the parametric or the graphic, you can't combine them, but it's nice to have that kind of control should you need to tweak your system a little bit. Now we're nearly at the sound quality section, but there's 2 other kind of cool features I wanted to mention about these in case you haven't read up on this yourself. And that is that you can activate through the WiiMs what they call an adaptive EQ. The idea is that the equalizer settings will adjust and adapt based on the genres that you're playing to theoretically give you the best possible sound for those genres. Now, I'm not a big EQ guy, I haven't tested that feature out, and it's going to come down to personal preference whether people like it or not. But the fact that that sort of technology and capability is there, I think is really cool. The other thing that I think is a fantastic feature here is that these will auto-calibrate themselves for any sound delays. Now don't get too excited, that doesn't mean these are doing timing correction for your speaker system. What it means is that if you're running multiple WiiMs in your house, running them as a sort of a house-wide multi-room system, what these are going to do when you first set them up is to run a quick test to see if there's any delay, or more to the point, see what the delay is, between the time that the signal is sent through, when it's released from the WiiM, and then when it comes out of the speaker. The idea of that is that if there's significant lag, let's say it's coming out of your WiiM, going through some sort of a DAC that's doing some processing, then out to a power amp, and then onto your speakers, that could take longer than in another room where maybe it's coming straight out of the WiiM and into a pair of active speakers. In those situations, what the system's going to do for you is delay the quicker speakers so that the sound comes out of all speakers at the same time. So you're not going to get any weird echoes around the house. Everything's going to be crystal clear and at the same time wherever you are in the home. So I think that's really, really cool. I don't know if that's unique to WiiM. I'm guessing brands like Sonos already take care of all that because it's kind of a more contained system. But it's nice that you can have seamless audio throughout every room of your home, and it's all done very, very simply. I can't stress enough, the app for the WiiM setup is so intuitive, so simple, it's really, really excellent. And so with all that said, knowing that I think the sort of functionality, the setup, and the app for these is brilliant, let's start talking about how they sound. For all my detailed testing of the sound quality of these, I was set up running the outputs from the WiiMs, sometimes direct from them, sometimes via an external DAC. I'll talk about the DAC when we get there. But whatever output chain I was using, the endpoint was always the Soloist 3 GT, that's the single-ended version of the Soloist, and then that was feeding into the Focal Utopia 2022 edition. Now I did also run the WiiMs with my active speakers in the living room, that's a pair of BLab 3s, so they've been given lots more use than just connecting them up to the Soloist. But the point is, for my more sort of technical but still subjective analysis of the sound quality of these, that was all done through headphones, so I could really hear what was going on in terms of resolutions, detail, still staging and everything as well. And I decided to start my testing at the top. Normally what I do in these reviews is I'll start at the bottom and work my way up, but I thought for this one, let's see just how good the WiiMs can get. So I took the Pro Plus, and the first test that I decided to do was to see how the internal DAC was performing compared to an external DAC. And so what I did for this part of the test was I took the line output from the Pro Plus into the Soloist GT, and I then took also the optical output from the Pro Plus and fed that into the EverSolo DMP-A6 using just its DAC. So the DMP-A6 was not running as a streamer, it was just working as an external DAC, to compare what it's like to run the internal DAC of the Pro Plus versus a high quality external option. And what I would say was that the sound coming out of the Pro Plus was kind of smoother in some ways than via the external DAC, but it was also harsher in the treble. And that might sound like a contradiction, but what I'm getting at there is that the overall sense of sound didn't have as much detail and resolution by just a small amount, and then up in the upper registers it was a little bit harsher. And so what I found was that the Pro Plus was actually lacking a bit of texture in comparison to the external DAC, and what I also found was that the soundstage was significantly narrower from the line output. So in other words, going to an external DAC of a good quality is definitely going to upgrade your sound compared to the internal DAC on the WiiM Pro Plus. That's not to say the internal DAC is bad, but there's benefits to be had by taking a digital output to a high quality device. I also found that the bass was a bit softer and less controlled from the line out, and realistically, it was kind of no contest. In my mind, if you want to get the absolute most out of your WiiMs, you're going to want to take a line output and send that to an external DAC. That raises questions that we'll answer throughout the course of this review as to which level of WiiM you need to get the most if you're going to be running an external DAC. But what this showed me for now was that whilst the Pro Plus does a good job, it's not the be all and end all. This is not a single box solution to replace high quality components. It's excellent for what it is, I'm not debating that, and we'll break that down further in a second. For anyone that thinks that just because this is running an AK4493, which is a lovely DAC chip, anyone that thinks that that's enough to turn this into a true high-end audio device has probably not done comparisons with higher-end gear. Now, I should also clarify here that WiiM themselves in their marketing say that this is as good as anything up to about a $300 external DAC, and I agree with that. I think that's about the right point. I think WiiM's been very transparent there, and I think that's fantastic. The key point is that by spending a few $100s on a DAC, you can very quickly and easily get even better sound out of your WiiM. And by the way, I should mention at this point that while I had the WiiM Pro Plus set up in the way that I did with the DMP-A6 from EverSolo, I thought this was a good chance to check how the EverSolo compares if I ran that as a streamer and compared the streaming through the DMP-A6, so basically streaming into the A6 and then using its internal DAC to feed into the soloist, versus using the WiiM as the streamer, feeding out of the digital output and into the DMP-A6. Hopefully that makes sense. So essentially we're using the DMP-A6 as DAC for everything, and what we're doing is we're switching in and out the WiiM as the streamer or the EverSolo A6's streaming stage as the streamer. And the good news is that what I found there was no significant difference, no discernible difference between the A6, using the A6 streamer that is, and the WiiM streamer. So that tells me that the Pro Plus is doing just as good of a job streaming as the DMP-A6's internal streamer. And therefore, if you don't need the display, the interface, etc. of the A6, the WiiM Pro Plus feeding out to an external DAC is doing just as well as something like the A6. So that's some good news for WiiM Pro Plus owners or potential owners. It's absolutely a fantastic streaming device. But then this raises a whole nother layer of questions, which is if you're going to be buying a WiiM Pro Plus and feeding it to an external DAC, is there any point spending the extra, or should you just go for the Pro? Remember, the only two differences here are that the Pro uses a lower grade DAC compared to the Pro Plus, and then if you are running a line input, the Pro Plus handles that input at a higher sample rate. So if the line input is important to you, you may still want the Pro Plus, but if you're just using it to stream music that's fed to an external DAC, there may be no benefit in the Pro Plus. And so my next test was to put both of these up against each other and start to see where the value actually lies. Now, of course, one question is, how do they compare if you're not using an external DAC? So let's start with that. For this test, I was using the track For Granted by Yaeji, and starting off using the line outputs from both of these feeding into the Burst & Soloist 3 GT, what I immediately heard going between the two was that the Pro, the lower level one, does have an even narrower soundstage again. So if we think back to the last test, running the Pro Plus to an external DAC gave us maximum soundstage width, running it then via the line out reduced that width a little bit, and now running the line out to the Pro reduces it a little bit more. And so this is one of the key things we notice is that as you're going down in quality, it's your soundstage that tends to decline first. Something else that I noticed was that the soundstage became quite flat from the WiiM Pro. The Pro Plus gives you a little bit more sense of depth and layering in the sound, in other words. And I felt that from the WiiM Pro, the dynamics and the sense of resolution was also reduced as well. The music wasn't as alive and engaging from the Pro. Again, it's not to say it's bad, but it's clearly not as strong as from the Pro Plus. And this is a point where it's worth considering what you're actually buying these for. If you're buying them just to give you some nice background music around the house to enjoy some tunes, then you probably don't need to go above the Pro. But if you're ever going to sit down and do any kind of critical listening, if you want to sit back with your favourite drink in a nice comfortable chair and just immerse yourself in music, that's where the Pro Plus might come into play better. Or take an external feed from either of these out to a DAC and upgrade even further. And so it's really going to come down to what your use case is and what you're looking for from the device. And with that in mind, let's talk now about what happens when you do take a digital feed out of both of these and use an external DAC. So now essentially what we're doing is we're bypassing the Texas Instruments DAC in here and the AKM DAC in here, and we're using an external DAC, so these are just streamers only. The moment you do that, the difference between these two completely disappears. As a pure streaming device, there is absolutely no benefit in having the Pro Plus. As I said before, if using the line input at maximum quality is important to you, that's where the Pro Plus might have a benefit. But if you're just using these as a streamer to an external DAC, whether it's a high-end DAC, a standalone DAC, whether it's your AV receiver that you've already got, whatever the external device is, the moment you do that, there is absolutely no reason to buy the Pro Plus. Just get the Pro, it's going to do just as good of a job. So that's only we're talking about here, just to make it really clear, that's only if you're taking a digital output. So if you're planning on plugging in the optical or the coaxial, feeding that out to some sort of external device, don't buy the Pro Plus, just get the Pro. Save the extra money that you'd spend between these two and put it into your DAC if you can. But that also raises another question, which is if you're actually getting the same benefits whether you go the Pro Plus or the Pro using the digital outputs, then couldn't we just buy ourselves a WiiM Mini and take the optical output out of here and get the same benefits? And this is where things get really interesting, because for $109 this could be a huge saving compared to the $219 for the Pro Plus. Now, because I'd already identified the fact that the digital outputs were the same between these two, and we knew that the analog outputs weren't quite as good from the Pro as from the Pro Plus, I thought the most fair comparison was to put the Pro up against the WiiM Mini. I started off my testing listening to Dirt on My Diamonds by Kenny Wayne Shepherd, and my first thought out of the WiiM Mini was that it was a really thick recording. I thought maybe it was actually not a very good recording. It was the first time I'd heard this track, first time I'd heard this album, and I was wondering if they deliberately tried to make it sound a bit old, a bit lacking in resolution, and a bit thick. I quickly plugged in the external DAC and the sound did improve a little bit. This is still from the WiiM Mini, but it had me wondering if it was just a really thick recording. And so I changed over to another recording that I know is not thick. I know it's a good high res, or at least high quality recording. And now it was Full House by Wes Montgomery, comparing the WiiM Mini's digital output running into the DMP-A6 as the DAC, and then comparing the DMP-A6 with its own streaming stage feeding its own DAC. There was quite a significant difference. And what it actually showed me was that the thickness I heard on the previous track, that was coming from the WiiM Mini. Sadly, even if you're taking a digital output from the WiiM Mini, whatever's going on within its streaming circuitry is resulting in a lack of resolution, a lack of texture, quite a compressed and closed-in sound, and just generally a thick overall presentation. And so as I jumped between the Pro and the WiiM Mini, what I heard was that the difference in processing power between these two and whatever else is being done within the circuitry is making a really significant difference to the sound quality. Now, it's worth mentioning, I didn't talk about this before because I didn't want to get into too much technicality, but the internal processor within these is the same for these two, the Pro and the Pro Plus, but it's a much lower quality, a much lower power processor, lower power in terms of processing power. It's a lower processing power system within the WiiM Mini. And so that, plus the fact that as a very, very compact device, there could have been some major compromises in the circuitry design. That's just a fact of how things are as we make them smaller. The end result of all of that is a fairly mediocre sounding device. It's not bad, and again, if you're just using this for some convenience audio, listening to music around the house, etc., that's where the WiiM Mini is still a decent device. I'm not knocking it and saying it's bad, but don't fool yourself into thinking you can buy this, send an optical output to a high-end DAC, and that's all you need, because the WiiM Mini will absolutely hamstring your system. And so this was really interesting to me. What it showed me is that the quality of the processing power within the streaming circuit absolutely matters. Spending that little bit of extra money to get a high quality processor makes a really big difference to your sound quality. And so what this also tells us is that if you're just looking for a convenience device, something that's easy to work with, and you're not too fussed about the sound quality, the WiiM Mini is great. The app's amazing, incredibly powerful, it runs all the different services, does everything you'd want it to do. It's just mediocre sound. But the great news is that when you go to the Pro or the Pro Plus and you feed them to an external high-quality DAC, these guys are performing as well as $1,000 streamers. And what I mean by that is they're performing as well as things like the EverSolo DMP-A6 and the EverSolo DMP-A8. The key thing here though, and this came up a lot in my reviews of the A6 and the A8, the key thing with those devices is you're paying for the interface and the extra functionality. The WiiMs are just streamers, that's all they're doing. Whereas with things like the A6 and the A8, they're giving you an interface, a display, they're giving you the ability to rip CDs into internal storage, you can connect up USB devices, they give you things like a preamp volume control in the case of the A8, they also give you things like a detailed DSP on the A8, and I covered all that in my DMP-A8 review if you want to know what that means. But my point is, they're very different products. Yes, they have the commonality of being streaming devices, but after that, they're completely different. And so my point there is not to say that one's better or worse, it's to say that if you only need streaming, if you don't want an interface, if you don't want a display, if you don't want the various inputs and outputs like USB connections for external storage devices, ripping of your CDs through an external CD drive into internal storage, if those things don't matter to you, don't buy an EverSolo, get yourself a WiiM. These are fantastic for the money and for what they're doing, particularly if you're running to an external DAC. If you're running just using the line outputs of these, I'd say they're okay, but don't expect it to perform sonically anywhere above their price tag. So the streaming functionality here is great, the sound quality is okay. And so where this leads us is that this is a fantastic way to get your hands on a brilliant app, very easy and intuitive access to streaming, and then have the versatility to upgrade it later by adding an external DAC if you want to. The starting sound is fine, there's nothing wrong with it, and the beauty of it is you can always upgrade it by upgrading your DAC. And indeed, if you were to pair this with a couple of $1,000s worth of DAC, these are good enough to get the most out of it. Not the WiiM Mini, forget about that one, but these two, absolutely good enough to get the most out of really premium systems via the digital outputs. And so all in all, I'm really impressed with the streaming capabilities of the WiiM Pro and the Pro Plus. I'm not so impressed with the analog outputs, but for convenience, they're just fine. And so these are some products that I'm really happy to recommend. I'm personally not a huge fan of the WiiM Mini. I think it's pretty mediocre overall. Both its digital output and its analog output are pretty limited in sound quality, but I think the Pro and the Pro Plus are absolutely great. Now the next step on this journey for me, and hopefully you'll come along this journey with me, is to find out if the streaming capabilities of things like the WiiM Pro and the Pro Plus, if they can compare to dedicated high-end streamers. I've got the Lumen D3 streamer coming in soon for review. That's a dedicated streamer. It's more like the WiiM Pro and the Pro Plus than something like the EverSolos that have the DAC built in and all the controls and functionality. And so you're paying a lot for just a streamer in the case of the Lumen. And so I'm really excited to find out if that actually can provide an upgrade over the sound of things like the WiiM. As we've seen here, going from the WiiM Mini to the WiiM Pro, that upgrade in streaming performance was significant, and I'm interested to know if it can get better still. So if you want to find that out with me, make sure you hit the subscribe button and also ring the notification bell so you don't miss that video. For now though, I hope you found this video useful and helpful. If you've liked the video, please give it a like. And until next time, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you again soon on Passion for Sound.